Hi, Charles. Thanks for helping my project. Could you say a little bit about yourself?
Sure, I am an IT engineer. I live in the Space Coast of Florida. I was born here, moved away after the end of Apollo, and came back home last year.
And I think you mentioned that both your grandparents and parents worked on the Apollo program.
Yeah, my grandfather actually moved here to the Cocoa Beach area 1958 or so when ABMA, the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, moved down to do some testing. And, he was put into NASA when ABMA was folded into NASA in 1960, I think it was. And my mother met my father here. I was born here, and grew up during the Apollo days. I saw every Saturn V launch, Skylab, et cetera, and kind of grew up with space as part of the background of my everyday living.
Oh, do you remember what your thoughts were at the time that Apollo was happening?
I thought it was the most exciting thing in the world. Of course, being a little boy, who doesn't love rockets? And literally outside the window of my house, you could look across the river, and if there was a Saturn V on the pad, you could see it lit up at night. I in my adult years, I called it my nightlife, but it was, just something that I saw every day, and it was really super exciting. This was, how we were going to the moon, and I got to see it. So yeah, I loved it.
About how old were you between 1969 and 1972?
I was about 11 years old. Of course, 10, 11, 12, right in there.
And whenever Apollo 17 launched, and did
Mhm.
you know it would be our last time to go to the moon?
I did. There was a bit of sadness, around the family and, the neighborhood that I lived in, because it was the last time. People were excited because it was the first nice launch of the Saturn V. We were all looking forward to that. But we were a bit sad. We knew that Skylab was coming up. The shuttle had been announced by that point. But, a lot of people had worked a long time, a lot of hours. And, they were sort of sad that the program was ending.
I've been reading a lot of Jerry Pournelle lately, a
Mhm.
science fiction writer, and he has a quote. It goes something like, I knew I would see the first person walk on the moon, but I never imagined I would see the last."
Yeah, that was really sad. And it's disappointing that we haven't gone back in the 50 years, since Apollo 17. I'm excited to know that we'll be going back soon. You can tell that the excitement around town here is starting to build up as Artemis prepares to roll to the pad. It's going to be very real when you can drive up US 1 and just look across the river and see it sitting out there. And when it launches, that's going to be a big day for everybody here, I think.
Um, Now, looking back, do you have any theories on why we stopped going to the moon?
I think it was a combination of politics and expense. There was this terrible idea that we went there just for flag and footprints. Yes, there was a huge political component. Possibly it was the largest one, but also the explorers that went there. I mean, they were astronauts, they were engineers for the most part, and pilots, but they were also explorers. And the idea was, as well, we've been to the moon, we've been there, done that. The fact is that we spent what, around 32 hours total time on the surface, and if you combine all the time that the astronauts spent walking around, and we just barely literally scratched the surface. So I think it was a mistake. I think it was a mistake born of politics of the time, and I think it's time to go back.
Yeah, I know some people that have spent over 32 hours at Disney World and they still feel the need to go back too.
Absolutely. You cannot see that place in one day or even three. And, with something like the moon, there are so many unknowns that we're going to be finding out. I find that tremendously exciting. I mean, the first Apollo mission, or Apollo 11, rather, We learned more about the origin of the moon from the sample that Neil Armstrong put in his pocket, the contingency sample, than we had known previously. We've learned a whole lot since then. In fact, we're just now opening Apollo 17's final samples. They were, put away in order to allow technology to mature, and they're being opened now. But I think that when we go back, we're going to find out things that we had never possibly even conceived. And I think that that's really great.
I think one challenge for us as space advocates is that those discoveries are really sort of on the micro fundamental level and really hard to boil up into meaningful information for the general population.
Sure. Well, I can counter that with, it was not only what we learned on the moon, but what we learned about how to get there. And the biggest example that I like to use is that in 1960, when Apollo was announced, microcircuits, or integrated circuits rather, what we call chips, were just a laboratory curiosity. They had been used here and there by the Air Force, not together all that successfully. But in order to guide the Apollo capsule and lunar module to the lunar surface, there was a volume constraint, and therefore a computer had to be developed that fit into that volume constraint. To do so, MIT was given the task of building the computer, and they pulled off the shelf integrated circuits. Integrated circuits were developed, even further than they were. At one point, Apollo was using 60% of the global supply of ICs. And, today, we call those integrated circuits chips. Chips obviously have changed the world because it gave us, microcomputers and then personal computers. And look what that did to change the world. I often say that, without the kickstart of Project Apollo, not only, using this technology, but developing it out to a point where it was commercially viable, that we may not have had the computer revolution that we saw in the 70s, maybe for another 10 years or more, if at all.
Well, in addition to that, whenever Apollo was shut down, you had a large engineering workforce that had experience, that knew how to solve problems, that was suddenly available in the private sector. And I think the impact of that's not fully appreciated either.
Right, you're very right about that. Those engineers went on to other jobs, be it in aerospace or other engineering disciplines. And one other thing is that as a result of the tragedy of Apollo 1, that modern project management was born. And this is something I use every day in my job. I cannot think of anybody that's in a technical position that doesn't use $60. We didn't get all that much. Well, in fact, we did get a whole lot. And I think that if you look at it holistically, the payback has been tremendous, and that not only did the government get their money back in terms of tax remittance from these companies that benefited from the technology, but mankind has benefited in the terms of it's helped us live the life that we live today, the modern life, in ways that we don't even realize.
I think those are definitely some benefits from Apollo, where the space program was really leading the state of the art of the technology. But
Sure.
Now I feel like sort of the role's been reversed. So much emphasis is on commercial off-the-shelf technology, proven technology, reducing risk, reducing cost. And I don't quite see the same engine of ingenuity from the space program as we had in the Apollo program, because we're actually leveraging what was used in the commercial sector and using that in space, as opposed to developing things in space and then using that in the commercial sector.
Yeah, that's probably true. We've become much more risk averse as a society. Returning to the moon doesn't have the deadline like the Apollo program did, with Kennedy's promise to get to the moon by 1970. But I'll also say that there is a lot of innovation that's going on in the space program right now. While we're trying to use off the shelf technologies as much as possible, there's been a lot of development in materials technology. There's been a lot of development in, actual mechanical engineering technology to, leverage these existing technologies and make them work in an environment that's far more extreme than anything that they had been used in before. I mean, just the forces of a rocket engine are almost incalculable to the human mind compared to, say even a jet engine. I mean, a jet engine is a marvel, but compared to a rocket engine, it's a garden hose next to a fire hose.
Now, whenever you talk to people who maybe are less engaged with the space program than you and I are,
Mhm.
and they're like, why are we going to the moon? What value do we hope to get out of it? Are there other things that you bring up in that conversation?
Sure, I think that not only humankind has a thirst for knowledge. We've always asked why. This is a good place to go and ask why in terms of what happened here. Why is the moon where it is? Um, that's one aspect of it, but also, and this sounds almost awful, but he who holds the highest ground has the advantage. And, in this world that we live in today, unfortunately, that is something that really matters. We need to know how to live on the high ground, or else somebody else that may not be as friendly to us as we'd like will. And I think that while Artemis is a peaceful exploration program, we will gain knowledge that will help us, be on that higher ground.
Yeah, talking about the high ground, the idea of the moon being sort of like a military, um, strategic point is really hard to wrap one's head around. Because I mean, we put missiles there, you would definitely see those missiles coming a long time before they ever got to the Earth. Probably take a couple of days. But I did see, I mean, Heinlein kind of proposed the idea of throwing rocks at
Mhm.
the Earth, um,
Right.
which potentially could be um, devastating and also um, difficult to confirm whether or not it's a natural phenomenon or
Mhm.
something that was actually done by an adversary.
Sure.
Um, but I recently saw a YouTuber, I think it's called the Angry Astronaut, who
Sure.
was talking about China's plans to go back to the moon and the fact that they were planning to put a fairly large nuclear generator there
Mhm.
that, in his estimation, would be large enough to drive a mass driver that could be used for just that purpose.
Right.
Um, and I, I was wondering, how you sort of process and think about that, especially considering recent geopolitical events.
I don't like it, but it's also just a reality. The Chinese may do that. Other countries may do that. I'm not necessarily sure that, we should build a weapons facility on the moon, but I think that we should be capable of going there, monitoring and knowing, the worst threat is the one that you don't know about. So by going to the moon, by monitoring the moon, and the Space Force just announced that they're going to put a satellite up to monitor lunar activities. It's a lunar satellite, I should say. That's important too. I think that if push comes to shove, yeah, we will have to have a strong military presence on the moon. I hope it doesn't come to that. I'm more for peaceful exploration of space. I think there are resources on the moon that we could possibly exploit. We've heard of helium-3 and its potential to be used for fusion. I don't know if that'll come to fruition. Certainly probably won't happen in my lifetime or maybe even yours. But the potential is there. We, like I say, we spent 32 hours on the moon. We just scratched the surface. We don't know exactly what minerals are up there. Could be that there are some rare earth minerals that are difficult to attain on the Earth, where we could get those off of, the surface or below the surface of the moon and use those here, for our technologies at home.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a good point. I mean, it's about what we don't know that is the most valuable. And
That's
since we
right.
don't know it, we can't put a value on it. So
Right.
some
We
people
don't
set it
know
as
what we don't know.
some people put it as 0 and some people put it as infinity, and both of them are wrong. Somewhere
Sure.
in the middle.
Yeah, that's right. And the best way to know is to go and find out. I think that Artemis is a very expensive program. I'm hopeful that the price will be driven down through time, through economies of scale, through repetitions of experience, et cetera, but and reuse. But if we don't go, we won't know. And I'm really excited that we're finally returning.
Um, so I mean, the space industry has really perked up in the recent time. I mean, we have SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, a lot of commercial lunar payload services companies like Intuitive Machines and Astrobotics. You have Rocket Labs, which is the second private company to put something in orbit. And they came from New Zealand, which I'm like, wow, if a little, I don't mean to offend any Kiwis out there, but if a little island nation like that could create a space industry, there's nothing keeping anybody back. Of course, Kiwis would say that they're special, so I think that's probably evidence they are. But, I feel like, and I wanted to run this by you to get your perspective if this feels accurate, but I feel like the 2020s are what the people who lived in the 1960s expected the 1970s to be. So kind of convoluted way of saying it, but I was wondering what you thought about that statement.
Yeah, I think that that's very true. I mean, in the 1960s, we expected, I was a child, but I was around the adults, that were working in the program, every day. And they fully expected for the program to continue. I mean, the day that we landed on the moon, here in the local paper, Florida Today, there was a long article by early 1980s. I don't know whether that's true or not. Of course, we'll never know because it never happened. But the thought around here is that it would continue, and it didn't. It was disappointing for everybody. Yeah, Skylab was great, but there were only 3 or 4 launches for that, and then it was over. And then there was a long gap until the shuttle, and I think 1980, 1981 is when it launched. And I think that now the 2020s are exactly, this is what we thought would happen. We thought that private companies would come in and leverage the technologies that existed for Apollo and turns into, services that can be used by pretty much anybody. When I say pretty much anybody, you need to be a multi-billionaire to afford to, rent a SpaceX rocket and go to orbit. But you can do it if you have the money. And I think in the 2030s, 2040s, it's going to start to come into reach of the common person. Yes, it would be an expensive vacation, sure. But, a lot of people spend a lot of money on vacations to Europe or to Asia or, to even Disney World. It's not cheap to go there anymore. So, who knows? I think that if things continue on their current trajectory, it'll become within reach of the common person, probably by 2035 at the latest.
We've had a little bit of network connectivity issues, and I caught most of what you said, but it might be worth repeating just some of the key points.
Sure. I think that in the late 1960s, everybody thought that the program and the team that had been built would continue their work. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. We did have Skylab, but then there was a long gap until the space shuttle launched. But now in the 2020s, I think that we're seeing what everybody did think that would happen, that there would be companies that would come along and leverage the Apollo technologies and, make those less expensive. And, why the average person who's not a billionaire can't go to orbit right now, those that do have the money can. And that's just an exciting thing. There's a private mission that's launching to the space station in just a couple of weeks here. I think by 2035 that people will be able to, it'll be an expensive vacation, but yeah, they could go up into orbit, spend a few days. There'll probably be some sort of facility like a space hotel, if you will, for them to go to.
Now, SpaceX has been doing a lot of development. Their Starship Super Heavy system, they're talking about having reusability down to the point of being able to use the same craft as many times, like 3 times a day. And, if they're able to do that, that'd be completely transformational. And I think will really open up space. But, there's a lot of discussion about if private companies are doing all of this, then what is NASA's new role in space? Because used to NASA did everything in space, and now the private sector is doing a lot of stuff. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that you could look over to the other side of NASA that people often forget, the aeronautical side. NASA explores new technologies in airplanes. For example, they're almost to the end of a program to develop a far quieter supersonic transport plane that could be used over land and not disturb people. They've done other things to make airplanes more efficient. For example, the nacelles at the end of the wing of a passenger aircraft, that's something that's a result of NASA research, et cetera. So I think that what they'll do is they'll push the technology, but also NASA, instead of building rockets and exploring space, will probably shift more to exploring space and utilizing the private companies as services to enable
that. That's a good point about the aviation bit. Well, if it was safe and affordable, would you take a trip to space?
Oh yeah. That was the dream I had as a child. And, the reality of watching others do it from up close and, actually meeting them, because astronauts are generally down to earth people. And my grandfather was in a position to where astronauts became friends of his, came over to his house. So, of actually knew his children and saw that they were just like my dad. And, I saw that. So it became my dream too. And, unfortunately, because of the trajectory of the industry and the trajectory of my own career, that never happened. Everybody wants to be an astronaut when they grew up, but, unfortunately for most of us, it doesn't happen. But given the chance, I would do it in a moment.
How far would you go? Just to orbit, to the moon? Would you immigrate to Mars?
I would at least go to the moon. If I were 20 years younger, I'm in my 50s, I would probably consider going to Mars. It's the thing of it is that I have responsibilities here of family and, other things. So I can't just say, well, I'm going to pack up, move to Mars and spend the rest of my life there. I doubt my wife would like that. I would certainly go to the moon given the opportunity.
But let's assume that some of your descendants actually go to Mars, and your great granddaughter or grandson is now in high school and lived on Mars his or her entire life, and is in history class doing a project on the 2020s, just like we might do a project on the early 1900s or something. And he comes across this video and is looking for a tidbit to put in his paper on what the 2020s were like. Is there anything that you think would be good for future generations to know?
Sure. There is an ethos in very large projects that's called crawl, walk, run. I think that we have learned how to crawl into space. Apollo and the space shuttle probably taught us how to walk. Now we're learning how to run. This is the first steps of running.
That's awesome. And, whenever you think about the future of humanity, like 100 years, 200 years from now, how realistic do you think you would have descendants that are living in other places besides Earth?
I think it's very realistic. I think that the human thirst for exploration will lead us to at least attempt a Mars colony. I think that when we do attempt it, we'll learn things. And I think that there needs to be some sort of economic viability, not necessarily monetary in value, but there has to be a reason to be there. I think that we'll find those reasons, and I think that people will stay out there. I think that there's a lot of value in the asteroid belt, for example, that I think we'll exploit. And I think that there are other values out there yet undiscovered that we'll definitely exploit. So I'm very hopeful that in the long-term future that we will become a multi-planetary species.
It's kind of interesting to me how some things become sort of self-fulfilling in a way.
Mhm.
Like there's no point in putting a hotel in the middle of the desert where nobody is. But then you see
Right,
Las Vegas developed and you're like, well, we should put another one there and another.
right, exactly. And Palm Springs.
Uh,
You know,
I'm a
the
little less familiar with Palm Springs, but
Sure, me too. But people wanted to get away from the cold weather of the north, so they went in the desert outside of Los Angeles and had some water available to them through a river, and built some golf courses and built a nice resort. So I think that you could use that as sort of a metaphor for what will happen with space. Is we will find resources out there to explore. I mean, to exploit, and we will exploit those, and these will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. This hotel will exist, and people will want to go to it.
well, Charles, I know we covered a lot of topics.
Mhm.
Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to, or did you have any questions for me?
No, I don't have any questions, but I would like to say that it's important that humankind look up and plan to explore, because there's a lot of out there to explore, and as long as we don't blow ourselves up, we can go do that now.
Well, I hope we don't blow ourselves up. That would be bad. But living on Mars is going to be horrible
Mhm.
for many generations. And I keep wondering what would push people in any significant numbers to go and live on Mars. And I think it may be the same thing that pushed people to leave Europe to come to North America. It's just not so much the opportunity, but that the situation got
Exactly.
so worse that they much prefer
Mhm.
their they much preferred the known natural challenges to the humankind ones that they couldn't understand.
Exactly. That's the thing is that it wasn't exactly comfortable to move from England or mainland Europe to, say, Jamestown or to the colony of Georgia, et cetera. I mean, I've been to where the colony of Georgia was founded. It's miserable there in the summer. People came anyway. Some people thrived, and that's, I think, what's going to happen with space.
Yeah, I mean, if Starship was flying to Mars now, and there was even a little small colony there, I think given the possibility of superpower conflict, even at the levels that we have at this moment, would
Mhm.
drive a certain number of people to go uh,
Sure.
to Mars.
Absolutely. That and the promise of freedom. We live free in the United States, but other people in other countries, maybe not as much or not so much. And I think that people will, say, hey, I can go and have a different kind of life with new freedoms and new responsibilities, that I'm not under the umbrella or the pin of this other government. So we'll see. I think that it'll happen.
Well, Charles, thank you so much for your time, and
Mhm.
I hope you have a good rest of your day.
I hope you do too, and thank you for your time. It was an enjoyable conversation.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.